Hello, my name is J. Atkinson. I am a retired Unitarian Universalist minister, and I'm speaking to you here in the sanctuary of the Unitarian Universalist Church in Berkeley, California. The Unitarian Universalist movement goes back 200 years in America and goes back another 200 years to the 16th century in Eastern Europe, which is something I'm going to talk about in just a few minutes. One of the characteristics of Unitarian Universalists is that we have often been regarded by conservative Christianity as a heresy. And the word heresy has an interesting origin. It comes from a biblical word, heretikon in Greek, which means choosing, or a heretic is one who chooses. And that's been a feature of Unitarian Universalism throughout its history. We are people who emphasize the importance of individual choice in matters of religious conviction. One of the earliest heretics that we look back to in our own history is a man named Michael Servetus, who was born in Spain in the early 1500s, wrote a extremely heretical book for its time titled The Errors of the Trinity, and 20 years later was burned at the stake for his efforts. Not by the Catholic Church, incidentally, but by his fellow Protestants. Servetus introduced a set of ideas that spread among radical thinkers in especially northern Italy, who took up his ideas and began to make their own kinds of challenge to the traditional Christian doctrines of the Holy Trinity and of the practice of infant baptism. Eventually, actually not too many years later, things became too heated for them in northern Italy because of the Catholic Inquisition, and they fled away from Rome. One of the places they ended up in was southern Poland, where there was already a Calvinist church established, and they began to import into this Calvinist church some of these heretical ideas. In that way, the movement that we now know as the Polish Brethren took its roots. They challenged the traditional doctrine of the Trinity. They began to substitute adult baptism for infant baptism, and they established one of the first examples of what we now call the free church. That is, a church that is free from state control. The Polish Brethren, while not direct ancestors of our American Unitarians and Universalists, nevertheless followed the same path and were swayed by some of the same kinds of thinking that have been characterized in Unitarian Universalism today. I mentioned the challenge to the doctrine of the Trinity. They, in their own churches, and I'm speaking now in the 1560s and 1570s, 1580s, when their churches began to spread and be founded, they developed a notion of the church as a learning community, a place where people with differing views would come together to hash out their conflicting views with the idea of coming to some agreement about what their collective belief might be and how they would put it into words. They developed the idea of the church as a tolerant place which accepted a diversity of views, so that the germ of truth that might reside within each differing perspective might be brought together into a common belief system. This was one of the most innovative ideas that the Polish Brethren came up with. They wrote, or members of the church wrote, about the importance of testing various ideas against human experience, against reason, and not simply taking the biblical account at face value. although in many ways they were strict biblicists. One of their reasons for challenging the Trinity was that the idea of the Trinity and the word Trinity never appears in the New Testament. It's a 4th century invention after the church was already well established as the official religion of the Roman Empire. So on the basis of the Trinity not appearing in the biblical record itself, they raised doubts about its validity as a point of Christian doctrine. Another innovation that they pursued was the notion of God as an all-knowing, all-seeing entity within the cosmos. They believed very deeply in the notion of human free will. They believed that in order for human beings to have moral responsibility for their own actions, that human beings had to be free to make their own choices, and that meant that the future was open. It was not determined until human beings and other creatures made the decisions that would determine what the future was going to be. This meant, importantly, since the future was not determined, there was no way for God to know the future. So God's omniscience, in their view, was confined to knowledge of the past and to knowledge of future possibilities, but not future actualities, because those actualities remain to be determined. So they developed a, we might call, heretical notion of God as relational, a God who interacts with the world, who is changed by what happens in the world, and whose self-understanding is therefore changed by what happened in the world. This was a radical idea, not only for its own time, but for a lot of people even today. A God who is relational, who reacts back and forth in relationship to human beings, was one of the most significant and characteristic features of their theology. Another development that we can find in among the thinkers of the Polish Brethren movement is, as I mentioned before, the idea of a free church, a church that is not under the control of the state, a church whose membership is determined by those who freely choose to join it. That's the basic meaning of the free church. And this led, a few decades later, around 1630, to the development of a very significantly fully fledged doctrine of church-state separation. This was 1630, I remind you, 2 centuries before the American Constitution and the early instances in New England where we identify the notion of church-state separation first arising in the American experience. Michael Servetus published his infamous book on the errors of the Trinity in the year 1531. It was immediately condemned, of course, by the Catholic Church as well as by other Protestants, but its ideas took root in northern Italy and in Switzerland. Switzerland is the location in and around Zurich where the Anabaptist movement first arose. Adherents of that movement noticed that infant baptism was not mentioned in the New Testament. In fact, they took as their model for baptism the baptism of Jesus, which had happened, as we assume, somewhere around the age of 30. And therefore, they thought that baptism, adult baptism, was the proper practice to follow. And so they began to rebaptize one another, rebaptize because as Catholics, they had already all been baptized as little babies when they were born. And now they were rebaptizing each other as adults with a very different emphasis on what that meant. It was an acknowledgement of joining the church and of accepting certain teachings at an age where they were able intellectually to understand and affirm those. So we have two ideas floating around: a challenge to infant baptism and a challenge to the Trinity. In northern Italy, radical thinkers who were open to ideas like this began to meet in discussion groups, and although they never formed churches, their activities were noticed, shall we say, by the authorities. And eventually, at the time that the Inquisition was established in the early 1540s, things became too hot for them in northern Italy. Some of them fled to Zurich and to Basel, other cities in Switzerland, but the pursuit went on, and eventually they had to flee further afield, and many of them found their way to southern Poland, in and around the city of Kraków, which at that time was the royal capital of Poland, and had a large contingent of Italian refugees, because the king there had taken an Italian bride back in the back around 1519, and so there was a large Italian population there to welcome them. And they brought these radical ideas with them. Many of them became active in the Calvinist church, which was beginning to grow in the 1550s in and around Kraków, and they began promulgating these ideas within the Calvinist church itself. Initially, they were condemned for that, but their ideas nevertheless had quite a bit of appeal to the intellectually curious members of the Calvinist church, many of whom came from the Polish nobility, and therefore had quite a bit of financial and socio-political influence. And it wasn't very many years, say around by the early 1560s, that a very strong contingent of what we would call now anti-Trinitarians began to take root and establish themselves within the Calvinist church. And so there developed a split. The Orthodox Calvinists, who were, of course, appalled by this, and many of the nobility, as I say, who were intellectually attracted to these ideas. A bit later on, with the arrival of another Italian immigrant, Fausto Socini, from the Italian Tuscan city of Siena, brought with him even more radical ideas, and began to suggest and emphasize the notion of human free will. Well, as you know, one of the principal doctrines of the Calvinist belief system was that of predestination. Calvin himself had emphasized a rather austere doctrine, proposing that the question of whether a person was saved or not, or as we might say, among the elect or among the damned, was decided for that person's soul at the beginning of time, at the creation. And there was nothing that one could do in the living of life to alter that. Good living had nothing to do with it. Well, Socini challenged this idea. Socini believed that human beings achieved their salvation by following the teachings of Jesus. It was not that they were saved by Jesus' death on the cross. Socini and the Polish brethren largely rejected that idea. Instead, salvation was the consequence of living in right relationship with one's peers in society, to promote social justice, to promote loving relationships, just as Jesus had done in his own teaching during his lifetime. That was the centerpiece of Socinus's teaching about the basis for salvation. Well, obviously, this was a direct challenge and a negation, actually, of the whole doctrine of predestination. And so this was one of the other heresies that we can attribute to the Polish brethren. In modern Unitarian Universalism, we no longer practice baptism in the traditional sense. We do bless the birth of a baby by usually sprinkling water on the baby's head as a way of blessing that baby's life and its potential for full living. The Polish Brethren Church, which was officially known as the Minor Reformed Church of Poland, in contrast to the Major Reformed Church, which was the Orthodox Calvinists, was a fairly decentralized movement. They had no presiding bishop in the early days. They met together frequently in synods to which ministers and important lay leaders and noblemen would come together and would discuss the challenges that faced the church. They worshiped in a variety of spaces. In some cases, and here is one example, this church in the town of Socinians was built in 1402. The town was owned by the Szafraniec family, a wealthy family, and they owned the town and much of the surrounding area. They built this church, which was, of course, in 1402, a Catholic church. But when the Szafraniec nobility went over to the Calvinist persuasion in the 1550s, the church itself became a Calvinist church, and not too many years after that, it became a Polish Brethren church, because this very church is the place where the doctrine of the Trinity was first challenged at a synod held in the church in January of 1556. Peter Gonesius was one of the students of a noble family who had studied at the University of Padua, had become, shall we say, infected with a lot of these radical ideas, and came back to Poland, having traveled through Moravia and spent some time with the Anabaptists now living in Moravia, and then returned to his native Poland, and fired up with all these new ideas that he absorbed, he boldly stood up at the synod and challenged the doctrine of the Trinity. So we could say that in 1556, that was really the beginning salvo that resulted in the establishment eventually of the Polish Brethren as a heretical movement in Poland. Not all of the Polish Brethren were fortunate enough to have a large church at their disposal. Many of them worshipped in smaller chapels that were erected next to the manor house of noblemen who built small chapels for their own worship and for the worship of the peasants who worked on their farms. And this is a sample, a couple of examples of one of those chapels. Nowadays they are in considerable disrepair, like this one, and others have been restored, such as this one in Ludinia, which has been restored by the owner of the estate, the contemporary owner of the estate, who has become interested in the Polish Brethren as a result of having bought this estate about 20 years ago. One of the most interesting episodes in the history of the Polish Brethren began in the late 1560s when a noblewoman persuaded her husband to make land available to found a completely new town out in the countryside of southern Poland. The town was called Raków, and in 1569, liberals from all over Poland, and some even from Lithuania, flocked to this new town as a kind of utopia, a liberal utopia. Eventually, the town matured into an intellectual center and established a printing press and an academy for the education of students, young students, mostly nobility, we assume, but maybe a few commoners. And the printing press began to pour out all kinds of liberal religious literature that challenged Orthodox Christian doctrines. This profusion of literature, books and pamphlets spread rapidly throughout Western Europe, and of course it was denounced by many, the majority, as being heretical, but it found sympathetic ears in a few places in Germany, and especially in Holland, which was already somewhat predisposed to religious pluralism and some degree of religious liberalism. And eventually it found its way to England, where it laid the groundwork in many ways for a heretical movement within the British Presbyterian Church and within the Anglican Church that eventually resulted in the formation of Unitarian congregations in England. Meanwhile, back in Poland, the Counter-Reformation was gathering strength, and the Polish Brethren became increasingly subject to persecution and to violent attacks orchestrated by the Catholic Church with the help of the monarchy. And in 1568, the little town of Raków was burned to the ground, or at least the printing press and the academy were burned to the ground. And it took another 20 years before the Polish Brethren, by an act of the Polish Parliament, were completely outlawed in Poland. They were required to leave Poland, go into exile, or to forcibly be reconverted to Catholicism. The ones who were wealthy and the intellectual elite of the movement did mostly flee. Many of them went to Transylvania, across the Carpathian Mountains from southern Poland. Others fled to Holland, where they formed relationships with liberal religious groups that were already well established in Holland. So the importance of the Polish Brethren lies not so much in what they did during their lifetime as it does in the printed legacy that they left behind, and in the enormous influence that this legacy had for developments, as I say, in Holland and England in particular. We know a lot about the Polish Brethren and their history these days because of a great deal of historical research that was carried out in the 20th century, in the 1950s and the 1960s and the 1970s, during the period of communist control in Poland. And there's an interesting twist that accounts for this. The Polish Brethren, to some extent, especially in the little town of Raków, adopted the practice of communal living, that is, the sharing of goods in a kind of quasi or early communist style. And the 20th century Polish communist government saw in this early history what they regarded, rightly or wrongly, as the earliest foothold of communist ideas in Poland 400 years earlier. And as a consequence, they poured a lot of research money into the Polish Academy of Arts and Sciences that had scholars, historians and religious scholars that looked back at this period of Polish history and were very strongly financially supported by Poland's communist government in carrying out a lot of this research. So in a strange way, we owe to the communist government a financial I don't want to say thanks. I can't be thankful for it, but for that government. But I can be thankful for the research that it supported, and as a result, our knowledge of that period has been greatly enriched by that support. Now, I've mentioned the history, a little bit of the history of the Unitarian and Universalist movements in America. They were not, in any sense, imported from Europe. They really developed indigenously in New England. for some of the same reasons that the Polish Brethren developed in Eastern Europe 400 years ago. The religious establishment of New England, you may know, was thoroughly Calvinist in its orientation. The Puritans, who exercised pretty much religious control over eastern Massachusetts in the early days of the colonization of North America, were strict Calvinists. But as the years went on, liberal movements, liberal ideas began to make their way into the rigidity of Puritan doctrine. After all, the Puritans had come over to really a wilderness to establish their churches in 1620, 1630, and years after that. And I think they must have had a pretty high degree of self-confidence in themselves to have braved the rigors of such a movement. And I think it was in some ways inevitable that self-confidence would have spilled over into their religious ideas. So eventually you find within the Calvinist Puritan Church, which eventually came to be called the Congregational Church of New England, you find growing confidence in what we now will call the human potential for development, for perfectibility. They began to question the notion of original sin and the idea that human beings were by nature depraved and incapable of self-improvement. And out of a sequence of thinking along these lines, a liberal movement developed within the Congregational Church that by the 1750s, just a couple of decades before the American Revolution, really came out into the open. And several ministers in and around Boston, where the liberal center was located, began to preach a notion of salvation by personal merit in much the same way that Fausto Socini had preached to the Polish Brethren 2 centuries earlier. As I say, they probably knew something about the Polish Brethren movement, but theirs was really a development from within their own thinking, not really an importation from the history 2 centuries earlier. So on the basis of their own liberalism and liberated thinking, they began to evolve a notion of human good, human educability, the notion that people could participate in their own salvation through the ethical living of their lives, and this reached a kind of high point in the preaching of William Ellery Channing in the 1820s and the 1830s, who advanced a doctrine of Jesus as the model for human living. Jesus had come, in Channing's view, to show human beings how to live in right relationship with one another. And this, for a period in the 1820s and the 1830s, became the primary doctrine of Unitarian churches at that time, which by then had split off from New England's congregational establishment. Meanwhile, the Universalists came at their own version of heresy from a different angle. Their central proclamation was that God is primarily defined by love. Not that God didn't exercise justice, but that love was God's primary characteristic. And a loving God, they believed, could not create or maintain such a place as hell. Every human soul eventually would be reconciled or brought back into relationship with God. This was the Universalists' central doctrine in their preaching. Of course, it was considered heresy by the surrounding Christian establishment, but many Methodists and many Baptists from New England churches were attracted to this doctrine. They were tired of hearing hellfire and brimstone hurled at them from their pulpits, and Universalism became quite a popular movement in the late 1700s and early 1800s in New England, and spread west into the newly developing states of Pennsylvania and Ohio and Indiana and so forth, so that the Universalist Church became quite strong in the middle years of the 1800s. So you see that in some ways the Unitarians and the Universalists were moving in some of the same directions, but there were differences both in social status and in fine points of doctrine. So it wasn't until 1961, just what is that, 60 years ago, 70 years ago, that the two denominations finally merged to form what we now call the Unitarian Universalist Association, and we have at the present moment here in 2019 about 1,050 congregations in North America and Canada. The centerpiece of Channing's interpretation of Christianity in the 1820s and the 1830s was really ethical living, and a primary text for the ethical living was Jesus' statement to do unto others as others you would have others do unto you, the golden rule. In the late 1830s and the 1840s, people in New England, and people in Unitarian churches in particular, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, began reading newly translated into English scriptures from Eastern religions, Buddhism and Hinduism in particular, and it was clear that something like the Golden Rule existed in those traditions too. And as long as they understood Christianity to be more a religious tradition of ethical living and not belief in a lot of certain doctrines, then one had to question, well, what's unique any longer about Christianity? You have the Golden Rule in Hinduism, you have it in Buddhism, you have it in to some extent in Islam. What does this mean for the basis of our understanding of religion as an ethical enterprise? And the answer was that Christianity began to be, people began to chip away at Christianity as the sole or unique basis for Unitarian ethics, because the same ethical principles could be discovered in other religions. Another turning point came in 1841 when a young Unitarian minister named Theodore Parker preached a famous sermon called "The Transient and Permanent in Christianity." And his basic question was, what aspects of Christianity are so fundamental to its core as to make them permanent, and what aspects of Christianity are just the overlay that gets changed in emphasis and in clothing, we might say, from one era to another. And what Parker asserted in this sermon was that much of what modern or people of that period took to be the essential core of Christianity were really little more than trappings, and that the underlying core of Christianity, which he associated to some extent with the teachings of Jesus, were what really mattered. The doctrines, the practices, those were the trappings. Well, of course, people were outraged, and Parker was condemned by many, many of his own Unitarian colleagues, but he sowed the seeds. He sowed the seeds for Unitarian thinking beginning to move away from its unique identification with Christianity. And this proceeded through the decades of the 19th century, the 1860s, the 1870s. In particular, in 1865, there was a national conference of Unitarians, and the status of Unitarianism, the status of Christianity within Unitarianism was up for debate, and many of the liberals were very disappointed to see so much Christian emphasis in the Constitution that the National Conference of Unitarian Churches established. And so they broke away and formed something they called the Free Religious Association, which over the next 20 or 30 years pursued a much more liberal and freewheeling course and became identified with what was called the ethical basis for Unitarianism. And all during this period, the status of Christianity within the Unitarian movement was being questioned and debated. And finally, at a conference in Saratoga, New York in 1894, a new constitution was written that to a much greater extent minimized the Christian basis for Unitarian identity. And from that point on, we could say that Christianity began to be one option, one religious option within Unitarian churches. You could also be a Buddhist Unitarian or a Jewish Unitarian. And so an interesting flip had occurred. In 1819, when Channing preached his famous sermon titled Unitarian Christianity, Christianity was the noun and Unitarian was the adjective. Unitarian Christianity was the particular kind of Christianity that the Unitarians were advocating, in contrast to, say, Calvinist Christianity or Lutheran Christianity or any of a number of other denominational labels. 100 years later, it was reversed. Unitarian was the noun, and you could be a Christian Unitarian, or you could be a Buddhist Unitarian, or later on even a pagan Unitarian. And so a complete flip had occurred within the space of 100 years. And that set the stage for the debate about whether one had to be a believer in God in order to be a Unitarian, a member of a Unitarian church. Eventually it was agreed reluctantly among some people that one did not have to be a believer in God, that atheists were welcome as members of Unitarian churches, and that openness persisted through the time of the merger with the Universalists in 1961, and today we have large components of pagans among our Unitarian Universalist membership, some theists or believers in God, others who would call themselves Buddhists, and others who would just call themselves, in a kind of nondescript way, spiritual believers. So we're quite open and quite wide open today theologically. I'm sitting here on the terrace behind the Unitarian Universalist Church of Berkeley, overlooking the San Francisco Bay. This location was donated to the church back in the 1950s by the well-known architect Bernard Maybeck, a member of the church, who made the land available for the construction of a new church building that was first occupied in 1961. I hope you have enjoyed this tour of some Unitarian history, going all the way back to the 16th century and the Polish Brethren, and moving forward through New England and the Transcendentalist movement up to the modern era. The Unitarian Universalist churches in North America are still represents still a rather small movement. We have just over 1,000 congregations with about 160,000 adult members, and we are still regarded as heretics by quite a number of people, but we are fortunately no longer being burnt at the stake. Only the targets of a few mean-spirited critiques now and then. Our churches are thriving, though, and we welcome new people into the church every month and every year, and we look forward to a growing possibility of liberating theological insight into the future.